Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Edge Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 8 waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about waiver wire prospects at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions going into Week 8. Some of these players benefiting from their own breakout performances in Week 7, while others are benefiting from the fact that their teammates got injured. Now, of course, we'll talk about some of the injuries that took place in Week 7, whether it was Amon-Ra St. Brown, Breece Hall, Mike Williams, DK Metcalf, David Njoku, and many more, and how their potential injuries are going to impact other fantasy prospects stepping up in their place, and of course, putting together productive weeks for us. So we'll talk about those players, of course, give you guys statistics and justified reasons as to why we want to go ahead and use our waiver priority and or fab to acquire the players that will be replacing them, or other players that separately have had breakout performances in Week 7, or potentially prior, they're going to continue to have fantastic weeks for us in fantasy football. Now, before we begin, a reminder, do not forget there are two teams on bye going into Week 8. It is the Kansas City Chiefs and Los Angeles Chargers. Of course, we have 4 teams coming back from bye week, so if in fact someone in your league potentially dropped, the Buffalo Bills, Eagles, Rams defense from prior weeks, you might want to go ahead, check your waiver wires, and prioritize those first and foremost in terms of, a couple defenses that you want to go after that are typically on high rostership percentages in comparison to some of them that I'm going to mention today. Again, majority of the players that I mentioned on today's video are going to be rostered in less than 50% of Yahoo leagues, just to kind of make sure that there's a wide range of availability for those of you who are in need of waiver wire help. Either way, let's go ahead and let's get into it. Before we do so, I want to thank you guys for supporting the channel. If you have not yet already and you want to continue to get daily fantasy football content from my direction to yours, you can go ahead and subscribe. Again, we are on our way to 80,000 subscribers. That is our next goal, and I cannot thank you guys enough for continuing to support the channel. So if you have not yet already, takes 2 seconds out of your day, go ahead and click the subscribe button and help yourself on the path to winning a 2022 fantasy football championship. Thank you very much. Also, if you guys haven't checked out PrizePicks, again, we're going to be doing a little bit more information in regards to a couple entries for tonight's Monday Night Football game between the New England Patriots and Chicago Bears at the end of today's episode. If you guys haven't checked them out, you can use promo code Andrew today when you make a first-time deposit, and you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. There's a link down in the description for those of you who want to continue to play daily fantasy football, whether or not you have players going in tonight's game, or potentially play in different sports, the NBA, the MLB playoffs, all of that encompassed via PrizePicks. So check that out today. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 8 waiver wire targets. First and foremost, let's begin with the running back position, because again, there's a lot of implications in regards to some injuries and or breakout performances going forward that are certainly going to make big difference makers on the entire fantasy football landscape. Now, like I mentioned a little bit ago, Breece Hall went down with an injury yesterday in that game against the Denver Broncos. Like many of us witnessed early in that game, Breece Hall had a 62-yard rushing touchdown and was looking fantastic. Unfortunately, went down with an injury, but if in fact all the rumors that we have heard over the course of the day, because I'm recording this on Sunday night, if in fact all the rumors that we heard from Robert Saleh, the head coach of the New York Jets, and all of the medical staff from that organization is to be true, and it is a season-ending potential injury, of course, we need to use all of our potential fab to pick up Mecole Carter. I think this is a empty the clip kind of moment, because we know how much potential value there is to this backfield. We know that the New York Jets are completely just incapable of throwing the ball on a consistent level with Zach Wilson. So they have to continue to run the ball on a consistent rate, to the point where, of course, you had Mecole Carter getting himself about 8 to 10 rushing attempts per game, while we continue to have seen Breece Hall get from 15 to 20 over the course of the last 3 weeks. If they're going to run the ball about 30 times per game, of course, Mecole Carter is going to be an extremely valuable prospect, especially considering he will also get PPR work out of the backfield as a receiver. Now, a couple stats that I wanted to mention in regards to Mecole Carter and his value. Of course, we have seen him be a valuable fantasy prospect. You go back to his rookie season. In fact, if you just combine the last 2 years, anytime Mecole Carter has been given 13 or more touches in a game, he averages 13.37 half PPR fantasy points per game. Pretty good average, to be honest. On top of it, anytime Mecole Carter plays 50% or more of the offensive snaps in a singular game, he's averaging about 12.12 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. Now, if you go back to his rookie year 2021 and saw how well he produced for the New York Jets, there was a span of time that he was given the starting running back job between weeks 4 through 10 prior to his injury, and throughout that span, he was averaging 14.77 fantasy points per game. We know how valuable he can be as a fantasy prospect, and that's exactly why we are addressing him first and foremost. Even though he most likely is rostered in majority of leagues, currently on Yahoo, 66% of leagues roster Mecole Carter. For those of you who have the ability to go ahead and pick him up still, It's absolutely something you need to do. Under the assumption that the Breece Hall injury news that is going to be revealed on Monday afternoon, Monday morning, when we get there, is going to be, potentially season ending of that capacity. If it's not, well, then of course we move on to the next prospect. We talk about Gus Edwards, running back for the Baltimore Ravens. Gus Edwards was a surprise activatable, running back on Saturday, Sunday, because, he's coming off his own ACL injury. And the question was, can we, see him immediately make an impact, or is he going to be on some sort of pitch count, snap count, where they kind of limit him and gradually get him back into the rotation? Well, he put all of those, questions to rest. Quite frankly, coming out and getting 16 rushing attempts for 66 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, 18 plus fantasy points in his debut for the 2022 season is ridiculous. I mean, the last time we saw him play was in 2020. And yes, throughout his career with the Baltimore Ravens, he has been a hyper efficient running back. I mean, in every single year of his NFL career, 2018, 19, and 20, he's always averaged more than 5 yards per carry. In fact, since week 11 of the 2018 season, that week in specific, because that's when Lamar Jackson took over this offense, we have seen Gus Edwards average 5.23 yards per carry on average since that date in 2018. It's pretty good. Now, when I've gone ahead and looked over his career, anytime he's been given 10 or more touches in a game, he averages 10.02 fantasy points per game. Of course, this is all prior to Sunday's contest where he put up 18 points. This is just isolating 2018, 19, and 20 throughout his career. Now, in the 10 full starts that he has had in his career thus far, he's averaged 11.62 fantasy points per game. In 10 of those games, 5 of them consisted of 100 plus yards, and 4 of them consisted of a 1 minimum touchdown game. Now, when we lock in on 2020 and just see how efficient he was, not even as a runner, but as a receiving threat within this offense, you find that, in 2020, he was averaging 0.752 fantasy points per rushing attempt that year. On top of it, he was averaging 1.338 fantasy points per target that season. I mean, amongst the best in that year. And obviously going into 2021, we expected a lot from him, but unfortunately the injury held him back. The fact that we have, of course, J.K. Dobbins having himself arthroscopic knee surgery, which is going to hold him out probably 4 to 6 weeks, leans me in the direction that, of course, Gus Edwards is going to be the starting back of this team based on what we've seen. Even though he only played 36% of snaps, on the 23 total snaps he played, he had himself 16 rushing attempts and 1 target. That is unbelievable numbers, and hopefully they're going to continue to trend in the right direction going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this upcoming week. Moving on, let's talk about D'Onta Foreman, our number 3 for the Carolina Panthers. Of course, the entire news of last Thursday was Christian McCaffrey obviously being traded to the San Francisco 49ers, and who is going to take his spot within the Carolina Panthers backfield. And pretty much we expected to see a little bit of a rotation between the 2 running backs, but on Sunday morning, we heard that Chuba Hubbard was going to be the main guy as he was the starter on the depth chart. And even with that being said, we were going in a direction thinking, well, this is probably going to be a Carolina Panthers team that is in the, fire sale mode. We want to tank for the number 1 overall pick. And, the players don't care. They got to, earn their keep. They got to continue to put out great performances so that they can earn a job for next season. They're not going to tank because they don't care what the organization does. They've got to put forth their best possible performances that they can. And by all means, we saw that from the Carolina Panthers as they completely beat down the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, D'Onta Foreman, prior to the 4th quarter, really was underutilized, but Chuba Hubbard went down with an injury early in that 4th quarter, which opened up a lot of opportunity for D'Onta Foreman to step up and make great plays. In fact, had himself 15 rushing attempts for 118 rushing yards, and quite frankly, a 15.5 fantasy point day, getting himself a little bit of utilization in the receiving game. Overall, played 54% of the snaps, but wasn't going to be capable if, in fact, Chuba Hubbard had stayed healthy and in the lineup. Because, again, Chuba Hubbard leaving that contest presents a lot of opportunity for him to step up and make plays. Nonetheless, we have seen D'Onta Foreman be a special back in the past, going back to 2021, when Derrick Henry was out for the Tennessee Titans. From weeks 12 through 18, we saw, of course, D'Onta Foreman be the primary back for the Titans, and he was averaging 12.2 fantasy points per game throughout that 6-game span. If he can continue to just put together great performances here for the Carolina Panthers as they take on the Falcons in 2 out of the next 3 weeks, of course, we could see ourselves pretty valuable, fantasy prospect here going forward. Now, on the other end of this coin, of course, we have Chuba Hubbard. And the entire question that revolves around him is, what is that injury going to entail? Is it going to hold him out? Because, again, they wanted him to be the primary number 1 within this offense. In fact, prior to Chuba Hubbard, getting injured, D'Onta Foreman only had himself 4 rushing attempts within the first 3 quarters of the game. Had 11 of those rushing attempts in the 4th quarter. So, if Chuba Hubbard is going to be healthy and immediately come back and there's not going to be any slowdown, I'm expecting him to be the primary back, and in fact, probably should be a higher ranked player on today's list. But considering I don't have all of that injury information privy to me at this current moment in time, but obviously seeing him put together a 14.3 fantasy point contribution in just 3 quarters of play is incredible. 63 rushing yards on 9 rushing attempts. That's a 7.0 yard per carry average and a rushing touchdown, all against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers front 7, which of course is one of the best in the league. Well, of course, they used to be one of the best in the league. Recently have not played well. In 2021, without Christian McCaffrey in the lineup, Chuba Hubbard has proven that he could be a viable fantasy back. In those 10 games, was averaging 9.04 fantasy points per game. In the 8 games where he was given 10 or more touches, he averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game. Of course, we know he could be valuable, and that's another one of these options that we want to go after if in fact he's not already rostered, because I know many of these guys were addressed this weekend and picked up. Moving on, let's talk about Tyler Allgeier. The main reason I wanted to mention Tyler Allgeier is because we probably have one more week without Cordero Patterson's return. And once we see Cordero Patterson's return, we're going to see a little bit of a shift within this backfield. But Tyler Allgeier coming out with another 16 rushing attempt game, 50 rushing yards. Yes, his yard per carry average isn't great, but that's mainly because the Atlanta Falcons, they don't care what the score is. They're going to run the ball on every single opportunity that they have. I mean, look at just what happened on Sunday. The Cincinnati Bengals were up 21-0 early in that second quarter, okay? And yet, we didn't see much of a, push throw the ball from the Atlanta Falcons. And then we get to ourselves at the end of the third quarter where the score is 35-17, okay? And still, the Atlanta Falcons in the fourth quarter are not throwing the ball. In fact, Marcus Mariota had 13 passing attempts and 8 passing completions in a game in which they were completely behind from the get-go. As soon as the stream that I recorded earlier today on Sunday morning ended, we were pretty much talking already about Tyler Boyd catching a 60-yard plus touchdown to begin the week. And that team was down for majority of the game, and yet they did not care. They wanted to continue to run the ball, and they did exactly that. They take on the Carolina Panthers in 2 out of the next 3 weeks. There could be a lot of value for him, not even as just the backup to Cordero Patterson, but maybe someone who continues to solidify himself as someone who's going to get 10 rushing attempts plus per game, as this team under Arthur Smith is a run-only scheme going forward. Let's move on to the final prospect of the running back position. It is Latavius Murray. Now, Latavius Murray is presented here, even though he is rostered in 40% of leagues, similar to Tyler Allgeier, because we did see Mike Boone go down with an injury in the second quarter. So, if in fact we're going to see Mike Boone miss some sort of allotted amount of time, and the fact that Melvin Gordon's coming off of a week in which he played 40 total snaps out of 79, and pretty much only had himself 11 rushing attempts, 33 yards, 4 targets, 2 receptions, and 6 fantasy points. On the other end, we had Latavius Murray with 8 attempts, playing 31 total snaps, and had himself a rushing touchdown for 9.3 fantasy points. Latavius Murray seems to be that number 2 RB. They're going to go back and forth between Melvin Gordon and him. And quite frankly, once this offense gets in a better direction, has a little bit of an easier matchup in comparison to the one that they faced on, earlier today against the New York Jets, there could be some value to be had there. That's pretty much going to cover it for the running back position. Again, if these players are available, go for them. But otherwise, we're going to go ahead and move on and let's begin talking about the wide receiver position, beginning with Parris Campbell. Parris Campbell has had 2 consecutive unbelievable weeks in fantasy land. In week 6 against the Jacksonville Jaguars, he had a very silent but deadly 15.2 fantasy points, where he had 11 targets, 7 catches, 57 yards, and a receiving touchdown. But many of us looked at that performance, including myself, and I thought to myself, well, okay, Parris Campbell had a great game, but we also saw Michael Pittman and Alec Pierce and Deion Jackson have great games in that contest. Doesn't mean that it's going to have to persist, but by all means it did. In week 7, he played 98% of the offensive snaps, while throughout the season on average, he's averaged about 86% of the snaps. Had a huge influx in terms of offensive snaps and a huge influx in terms of targets and receptions, setting career highs with 12 targets, 10 catches, 70 yards, and 1 receiving touchdown for 18 fantasy points. When you go ahead and look at the passing chart of Matt Ryan in week 6 and 7, of the 75 total completions that he has had in the last 2 weeks, 63 of those completions have been for less than 10 yards. Overall, he's just dumping it down close to the line of scrimmage. His arm is not capable of throwing the ball deep down the field, and quite frankly, this offense isn't really built for it. They're continuing to dink and dunk with Parris Campbell, the primary slot receiver within this offense, and with that being the case, he has incredible value because of that PPR upside availability and viability that he presents with the reception game continuing to get higher every single week. As of right now, again, taking on the Washington Commanders in week 8, it seems to me like this Indianapolis Colts team, they're in a little bit of trouble. Of course, Jonathan Taylor didn't look fully healthy, and until they get to that position, Matt Ryan's probably going to be throwing the ball 40 times a game. And if that's going to continue to be the case, expect Parris Campbell to get himself a lot of targets. Currently only rostered in 4% of leagues on Yahoo. Could be a fantastic option for us going into the future contests. Moving on, let's talk about Wan'Dale Robinson. Now, if we rewind back to week 6, we saw that Wan'Dale Robinson came out and had himself a pretty good day. In fact, scored a touchdown and pretty much caught majority of our attentions in regards to, oh, maybe he's the next man up in terms of the primary #1 wide receiver of the New York Giants. But like I've explained in the past, the #1 wide receiver of the New York Giants is capped at a specific ceiling because this team doesn't throw the ball enough. Again, when you have Daniel Jones running the ball 11 times for 100+ yards and a rushing touchdown, that obviously is going to cap the potential ceiling of the passing game ultimately. And it has. Now, even with that being said, Wan'Dale Robinson had himself a team high total of 8 total targets and 6 receptions. When you're continuing to be the primary target getter within your offense, you're going to have fantasy value that is, something that we just can't ignore. So going forward, even though he was a little bit banged up on Sunday against the Jacksonville Jaguars, the fact that he went from playing 15 snaps in week 6 to playing 53 snaps in week 7 leads me to believe that this is going to be a consistent wide receiver option, hopefully in the top 36 as those targets continue to build. And even though his average depth of target isn't going to be far down the field as he's primarily going to be used as a slot receiver, I expect to continue to see Brian Daboll, the head coach of this team, the former offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills, use him as the Cole Beasley of this offense, a slot receiving option that continues to get a high target count. And of course, one of those safety blanket options for Daniel Jones moving forward. Only rostered in 29% of leagues. Go get him. Moving on. Let's talk about Mecole Hardman. Mecole Hardman, 3 consecutive weeks of over 10 fantasy points, but mainly because he's been scoring touchdowns. You go back to week 5, scored himself a special teams touchdown. Go back to week 6, scored himself a touchdown down in the red zone. And then in week 7, had himself a nuclear performance of 3 total touchdowns, 1 through the air, 2 on the ground. But quite frankly, all 3 of them were jet sweep plays, where he's motioning across the formation and either being touch passed forward or handed off behind, Mahomes' back as he runs right into the end zone, and the excellent blocking of the Kansas City Chiefs continues to persist. Coming off a 26 fantasy point performance with 6 total touches, 4 receptions on 4 targets, 2 rushing attempts for 28 yards at those 2 touchdowns. Incredible production. But again, the last 3 weeks, 10 fantasy points, 11.7, and 26.5 PPR scoring format. Even though the Kansas City Chiefs are going on bye, when I look at this offense, I look at their upcoming schedule of having to play against the Tennessee Titans, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the LA Chargers from weeks 9 through 11. I think those are very much so favorable matchups where we can go ahead and plug in a player like Mecole Hardman, only rostered in 24% of leagues. And yes, he's not playing, a large majority of the offensive snaps. And if I was to pick a Kansas City Chiefs receiving option that I trust more, it's obviously going to be Juju Smith-Schuster. But outside of him, we got to remember that on Sunday against the 49ers, there were 5 different players for the Kansas City Chiefs offense on Sunday that scored a touchdown. If we're going to continue to get that large of an opportunity share of red zone opportunities for all these different options, of course, there's always a chance for Mecole Hardman to have himself another big week. Moving on, let's talk about Marquise Goodwin. Now, Marquise Goodwin had pretty much flown under the radar because when you have DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett on your team, there really isn't going to be anybody else garnering targets besides the tight ends and or potential running backs out of the backfield. But Marquise Goodwin, with a 0% rostership, came out with a 20.7 fantasy point performance, mainly because, of course, he had to step up and fill in for the lack of receiving potential. DK Metcalf was relatively slow early until he, of course, got injured and was carted off. Obviously, the x-rays as of earlier today were negative, but, obviously an MRI needs to come in the future. And when it does, we'll see what, that entirely entails. If, in fact, DK Metcalf is going to miss time, Marquise Goodwin could probably be his fill-in option, unless the Seattle Seahawks are going to make it a point to trade for another receiving option in the coming weeks. But either way, the way that Geno Smith has looked over the course of the season, it's just unbelievable, to be totally honest. The fact that he's able to elevate these receiving options to the point that they have, the fact that Marquise Goodwin had himself 4 receptions on 5 targets and 2 receiving touchdowns. Ultimately, again, if DK Metcalf is going to miss time, Marquise Goodwin has a lot of value. If DK Metcalf is back and there's no problem or only misses a couple weeks, Marquise Goodwin's overall potential is going to be lessened, considering the offense really just doesn't need him when you have 2 primary studs like DK and Lockett always on the field. Moving on, let's talk about Donovan Peoples-Jones. Now, speaking of, having himself relatively consistent production Donovan Peoples-Jones from weeks 4 through 7 has accumulated 27 total targets for 19 receptions, 266 receiving yards, and 34.3 half PPR fantasy points. That is 8.58 fantasy points per game on average. In the last 4 weeks, he has finished as the number 32, 48, 33, and just recently this last week, obviously barring the Monday Night Football game, the number 36 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. So he's pretty much a low-end wide receiver 3. And that's where we've had him ranked over the last couple weeks because he continues to get himself a pretty ample amount of targets and a good amount of receiving yards. And ultimately, if you're going to continue to put up, about 8 to 10 fantasy points per game in a half PPR and far more than that in a full PPR scoring format, then you have a lot of value. Currently only rostered in 20% of leagues, taking on the Cincinnati Bengals this upcoming week. Of course, this team's going to have to throw the ball. And when they do so, someone who's on the field for 93% of the snaps is going to have himself a pretty key amount of target share that is going to lead to fantasy relevancy in week 8 and going forward, especially once we eventually see Deshaun Watson back in this lineup. Moving on, let's talk about Zay Jones as our final wide receiver option. The only reason I wanted to primarily mention Zay Jones is because of his target, share. The fact that Zay Jones thus far this season is the number 27 overall wide receiver in terms of targets. He has 47 of them. He's the number 25 overall wide receiver in terms of total receptions. He has 31 of them. Yet, unfortunately, he's only the number 49 overall wide receiver in terms of receiving yards with 281. If, in fact, he's able to elevate his numbers just a little bit more, catch a little bit more of the opportunities that he is given. 47 targets, 31 catches, it's not a great rate, but if you continue to get into a direction where it leans to him catching far more of his total opportunities, then he's going to be a fantasy relevant option, especially considering they take on Denver, Las Vegas, Kansas City, and Baltimore in the next 4 games. Those are 4 very difficult matchups, and I can assure you this team is going to be pushed to the test. And the way that we have continued to see Trevor Lawrence spread out the ball, throwing it to Christian Kirk, Marvin Jones 10 to 8 times, while also seeing Evan Engram get like 7 to 8 targets per game, there's a pretty good target spread here. And if it continues to be as such, Zay Jones could have a pretty good upside in terms of value. All right, let's move on to the tight end position. Let's begin with Greg Dulcich. Beginning with our rookie tight end here, huh? Listen, Greg had a pretty good game. I mean, this is 2 back-to-back weeks where he's had over 8 fantasy points, and that's pretty much all we could ask for a tight end going forward. Really, the tight end position as a whole is so inconsistent. I mean, many of us obviously experienced what the heck Mark Andrews put up earlier today, which is pretty much a non-factor performance in any capacity. Obviously, he was bracketed for the entire game, but that's a different conversation for a different time. But for right now, let's talk about Greg Dulcich. Currently only rostered in 11% of leagues. In week 6, in his debut, obviously was on the injured reserve due to a hamstring strain that he suffered in the late half of July, and obviously didn't play until week 6. He had himself a receiving touchdown, 44 receiving yards, 2 catches with Russell Wilson. Then earlier today against the New York Jets, even with the backup quarterback, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 51 receiving yards. This pretty much is exactly what Nathaniel Hackett, the head coach of the Denver Broncos, was kind of telling us in the offseason. He said that we drafted Dulcich to come in and immediately be a vertical threat within this offense because that's how he was used in college and that's how we're going to continue to use him. Albert Okwuegbunam, who has primarily been his main competition prior to the season beginning in terms of what we expect to see as the starting tight end for this team, has been a healthy scratch in the last 2 games, meaning he has been healthy, yet he has been inactive. That leads me to believe that, of course, this tight end is going to be the guy for the Denver Broncos for the rest of the season. So if, in fact, you're in need of a tight end, this is someone that you might want to stash. Moving on to Irv Smith, coming off the bye week. Again, he's currently rostered in 41% of leagues, but if in fact someone dropped him in your league, they have the easiest matchup going into week 8, taking on the Arizona Cardinals defense. The Arizona Cardinals defense has given up an average of 16.49 fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends thus far this season on average throughout the first 7 weeks of the season. Within those 7 games, they have allowed 6 total receiving touchdowns, 3 of them coming from last week's performance against the New Orleans Saints, as both Juwan Johnson had himself 2 receiving touchdowns, and Taysom Hill had himself a receiving touchdown. Again, I don't count any of the rushing statistics that Taysom Hill put forth. Any receiving statistics by a tight end is accounted in terms of how many points are allowed to opposing defenses. But either way, I think it's a fantastic matchup. Of course, we most recently saw Irv Smith catch a touchdown prior to the bye week in week 6. So if in fact he's available, pick him up. He's a fantastic option. Moving on to Evan Engram. We just talked about Zay Jones just a while ago. But in regards to the amount of targets that are spread around this offense, the fact that just this last week we saw 10 targets go to Christian Kirk, 10 targets go to Zay Jones, and 8 go to Marvin Jones, and still we saw 7 targets go in the direction of Evan Engram for 4 catches, 67 receiving yards. Those are great statistics. Over the course of the last 3 weeks, weeks 5 through 7, we have seen Evan Engram average 8.4 fantasy points per game, 23 targets, 15 catches, 176 total receiving yards, and 25.1 fantasy points. As long as this offense is going to continue to spread it out, going up against the Denver Broncos matchup this week, which quite frankly is going to be difficult, I am still expecting a lot of production from Evan Engram going forward, currently rostered in 41% of leagues, identical to Irv Smith. Moving on, let's talk about Cade Otton. Of course, he is filled in for Cameron Brate, mainly because, of course, Cameron Brate has been dealing with an injury. The concussions that he has sustained thus far this season has held him out for some time. But the only thing that I wanted to mention in regards to Cade Otton, of course, he's widely available, only rostered in 14% of Yahoo leagues. But in terms of targets that the tight end position has seen from Tom Brady since week 4. Week 4, they saw 13 targets, 8 catches, 80 yards. Week 5, 8 targets, 6 catches, 43 yards. Week 6, 6 targets, 4 catches, 37. And in week 7, 7 total targets, 6 catches, 90 receiving yards. The tight end position for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is slowly but surely becoming more and more of a viable option going forward, as the other receiving threats within this offense are struggling, and quite frankly, the entire offense is struggling as a whole. So expect Cade Otton to continue to get more and more utilization within this offense going forward. Moving on to our number 5 option, we have Juwan Johnson. Like I mentioned him a little bit ago in regards to beating up the Arizona Cardinals defense last week with 2 receiving touchdowns on 5 total receptions. The main reason he was able to accomplish that was because Adam Trautman, the other tight end on this team, was inactive in that game on Thursday night. Again, it was a short week. So if in fact Adam Trautman is going to miss again, then going up against the Las Vegas Raiders, quite frankly, it is another one of these advantageous matchups for the tight end position. But if in fact Adam Trautman is back, we would then just forget about Juwan Johnson, just play Taysom Hill, and don't worry about it going forward. The final option at the tight end position I wanted to mention is Harrison Bryant. I mentioned it earlier today in regards to the injuries that were sustained in week 7. Of course, we saw David Njoku go down with an injury earlier today, high ankle sprain. As to whether or not he's going to be, utilized in week 8, the organization has already stated that it's quote unquote not serious. We'll see, with that. He was walking around with a walking boot, so I don't know exactly how not serious it is, but if in fact Njoku is going to miss time, Harrison Bryant, currently rostered in 0% of leagues, steps into a lot of opportunity. Since week 3, David Njoku has been averaging 7.2 targets, 6.0 receptions, 75.8 receiving yards, and 0.2 receiving touchdowns per game, all for 11.26 fantasy points per game since week 3. Of course, that kind of pace going for the full season would have probably landed, David Njoku within the 1,000 receiving yard, 60 plus catch range by the end of the year. Very easily. Going forward, I think we're probably in a situation where, yes, Njoku at worst probably misses 1 week, but if he's still going to do so, Harrison Bryant could be of value for those of us who need a tight end with both Everett and Kelsey out on bye. Moving on to the quarterback position, let's talk about Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones, somehow, some way, comes out, has a career high of 11 rushing attempts, 107 rushing yards. Unbelievable numbers, all while we saw Wan'Dale Robinson get a little bit beat up in that game. Daniel Bellinger leave the game with an eye injury, of course, bleeding everywhere, just a mess. But ultimately, Daniel Jones still put together a great performance on the ground, which was the biggest difference maker. When you're getting 107 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, a 16-point fantasy influx just off rushing statistics alone, that is what separates Daniel Jones from the pack. And if he's going to continue to be at that level, by all means, of course, he has fantasy value. But unfortunately, this is only the second time this season that he's put forward more than 20 fantasy points. The rest of the time, he's pretty much sitting in that 12 to 15-point range. If in fact that's going to work for you and you can just perfectly take 12 to 15 and will potentially love to see the upside of a 20-point game, but you're fine with that, go ahead, pick up Daniel Jones. He's another one of these options going up against the Seattle Seahawks this upcoming week, who most recently against Kyler Murray in week 6 gave up 10 rushing attempts for over 100 yards as well. Could be another great play here. Moving on to Jimmy Garoppolo. Even though Jimmy Garoppolo made a lot of mistakes in terms of fumbles, in terms of getting safetied, in terms of throwing interceptions, he still managed to have over 300 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns. Going forward, taking on the LA Rams this week, again, the San Francisco 49ers have beaten the LA Rams, I think, in 7 or 8 consecutive regular season games. That streak is only going to continue. I expect the utilization of Christian McCaffrey to only open up this offense more and allow Jimmy G to be that much more of a viable option as a quarterback streaming play. Moving on to Taylor Heinicke. Like I mentioned earlier this morning to you guys, Taylor Heinicke was going to push the Green Bay Packers to their limits, and that's exactly what he did. He did exactly that, putting together a decent performance, even though he didn't look great early on. And I was absolutely scared out of my mind because I have a league which I have Carson Wentz typically as my super flex starter, but I was rolling with Taylor Heinicke this week. he still put together a decent week in a 6-point per passing touchdown league, 4-point per passing touchdown league, 14.44 fantasy points, an okay game. But he gets to play against the Indianapolis Colts, against that team that anything can happen. Quite frankly, I mean, I honestly think that there was a huge potential for the Indianapolis Colts defense to be legit this year, but it just doesn't seem like that's going to consistently be the case. And I think Taylor Heinicke could be another one of these potential prospects that we want to go ahead and roll out there as a streaming option, but probably won't need to this week. Moving on to Marcus Mariota. Again, like I mentioned earlier, Marcus Mariota only had 13 passing attempts and 8 passing completions on Sunday. Still had himself 6 attempts on the ground for 31 rushing yards. That's 3 games in a row of 30 or more rushing yards, but only 12 fantasy points. Unfortunately, Marcus Mariota has pretty much been rendered to just being a game manager. And yes, if he gets those, influx of rushing yards or a rushing touchdown, it helps. But outside of the 75-yard receiving touchdown from Damiere Byrd, if we go ahead and extract the 75 passing yards out of the 124 total that he put forth on Sunday, unfortunately, not a great game for him. Moving on to Davis Mills. Davis Mills somehow, some way, just has himself great games against teams that he's not supposed to really play well against, coming off of a 300 passing yard game and 2 passing touchdowns against the Las Vegas Raiders. Takes on a division rival in the Tennessee Titans. Quite frankly, he's had himself pretty decent games against them, and the Tennessee Titans secondary, unless you're Matt Ryan, really should be an easy matchup. So Davis Mills, another one of these players that I wanted to mention. The final player I wanted to go with, if in fact Jameis Winston isn't given the starting spot, which honestly they should have given it to him on Thursday, I believe Andy Dalton's probably going to be the guy going forward within this team. The upside that I wanted to present in regards to Andy Dalton, his potential going into this upcoming week, obviously coming off of a game of 361 passing yards, 4 passing touchdowns against the Arizona Cardinals. Honestly, it was pretty much 6 passing touchdowns, but 2 of them were towards the other team as they were pick sixes. But going up against the Las Vegas Raiders this week, the Raiders thus far this season, in their 6 games, have given up a minimum of 237 passing yards to opposing quarterbacks and 2 touchdowns to opposing quarterbacks every single game. I think the fact of the matter is the Saints are more of in a we want to start, Andy Dalton over Jameis Winston rather than we need to. And if they continue to want to do that, that's going to be the case going forward. All right, let's go ahead and let's talk about special teams, defenses, kickers, all that kind of stuff, beginning with Jason Myers. I mentioned him yesterday via PrizePicks as a candidate to easily surpass 2 or more potential field goals. Obviously, he racked that in, got himself 5 consecutive weeks of 10 or more fantasy points in fantasy football land. Currently only rostered in 32% of leagues. Absolutely needs to be picked up. We mentioned him last week, continuing to do so again. Moving on to Kaimi Fairbairn, another one of these players that has put together consistent performances thus far this season. 10, 11, 8, 7, 11, and 10. Those are his fantasy point contributions in 6 games. Pretty consistent for a Texans kicker. Moving on, Jason Sanders is the final player I wanted to mention, mainly because when I look around the entire, kicker position, there isn't much consistency across the board, but at least the matchup for the Miami Dolphins going into this upcoming week is favorable enough in my eyes to go ahead and trust it and think that Jason Sanders could put together a pretty good game, hopefully of double-digit fantasy points. Moving on to our team defenses, we talk about the Tennessee Titans first and foremost. Currently rostered in 41% of leagues, they take on the Houston Texans. If Davis Mills doesn't have a great game, if they're able to pressure Davis Mills the similar way that they did to Matt Ryan, of course, some turnovers will be made and some fantasy points will be locked in there for the defense. Of course, speaking of Matt Ryan, let's talk about the Indianapolis Colts defense. At times, they have played badly, but quite frankly, I think against Washington, they could force Taylor Heinicke to throw a couple picks. Taylor Heinicke was just throwing it up there and just allowing Green Bay to make plays on the ball, but wasn't able to come down with more than just 1 interception. Quite frankly, could have easily been like 5 or 6. That's how bad he was early on in that game. But either way, a decent option here if, in fact, we get Shaq Leonard back in the lineup. Moving on to our number 3, it is the Minnesota Vikings defense. As of right now, the Minnesota Vikings probably in a scenario where, again, the fact that they take on Arizona, if Kyler Murray sees any sort of, inconsistency upcoming here, if they're not able to run the ball as effectively as they did the other night in the passing game, isn't going to be as consistent, we could see the Minnesota Vikings defense be valuable not only this week, but in week 9. So we're kind of anticipating that and potentially stashing them for the next 2 weeks of production. That's pretty much going to cover it for me today in terms of waiver wire pickups. Let's go ahead and move on and let's start talking about some Monday night prize pick entries that we can make before we close out today's episode right now. All right, we've gone ahead and traveled to PrizePicks, as you can see to the right of me, whether it is the NBA, the Monday Night Football game tonight between the Bears and the New England Patriots. You can go ahead and participate in some daily fantasy. Travel to the description of the video, click on that link, and when you go ahead and make a first-time deposit using promo code Andrew today, you'll be given a first deposit match up to $100. So let's talk about the NFL slate tonight, specifically the total plays that I would like to go after. First and foremost, I've had a lot of good luck with field goals made. Earlier today, in regards to our Sunday morning live stream that I suggested to you guys, I talked about my favorite plays being the combination of the three running a singular entry slip of David Njoku, more receiving yards, Tony Pollard, more rushing yards, and of course, Myers, more field goals made. Obviously, that cashed pretty well. Ultimately, I think Nick Folk should be attached to every single one of your entries that you make tonight, primarily because 1.5 field goals for him should be an easy number to be able to surpass. Again, even though against the Cleveland Browns, we didn't see him get much utilization in terms of field goals, I think there's a very good chance on Monday Night Football, this is going to be a little bit of a slower game. And with Mac Jones finally getting back into the lineup, they're going to be forced to make a lot of field goals. I think this is a perfect attachment to any single slip that you want to go ahead and put forth. Of course, they have first half numbers for those of you who are trying to potentially predict what exactly is going to happen in the first half of these games, whether it is rushing yards, passing yards, receiving yards, fantasy score within the first half in a full PPR scoring format. You can go ahead, put forth a potential entry for tonight. If in fact you want to continue to play daily fantasy, check out PrizePicks today and use promo code Andrew. But again, the one that I want to go after certainly is easily field goals made and Nick Folk tonight getting the job done. Anyway, that's going to cover it from me today. Of course, we'll talk about running back rankings tomorrow. And until next time, guys, I'll see you. Peace.